how long is this war going to go on, he's definitely prepared for the next 10 years. That's what at least he said to me.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Aliona Hlivco, Managing Director of the Henry Jackson Society, a London-based think tank and policy-shaping organisation. Aliona, who's Ukrainian, was one of her country's youngest ever MPs and served as a politician for 13 years. She came to the UK in 2018, where she now lives. Aliona, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. You're currently on a work trip in the US, and I'll be asking you about that in a moment. But first, can I just ask you to tell me a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Hello, Kate. It's great to be here and talk to you. I started in politics very young. I managed to squeeze in 13 years, as you've mentioned. I started when I was 17, first year political science student in my hometown university. And that's when the Orange Revolution broke out in the country, the first social uprising for democracy, for the transparency of electoral process. And I think that kind of swooped me up, and politics never let me go since. I started with volunteering during the Maidan. That was the first Maidan in 2004, the so-called revolution in Ukraine. And then I started volunteering for one of the political parties. I did some freelancing journalism. And it just took me away all throughout my 20s through political protests. We were, most of the time, our political party was in the opposition. So it took quite a lot all the way to the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And then after the revolution and the tragic events, when we managed to turn the situation around, I became a member of parliament, as you noticed and noted, in 2015. And I stayed in politics, served my tenure until 2018 when I moved to London. And so now I'm here at the Henry Jackson Society.
And you obviously lived through very turbulent times in Ukraine as you were growing up. What was it like living through those two revolutions?
It was very emotional, I guess, for us young people, because we did feel like it was up to our generation to bring Ukraine closer to the rest of the world and to democratic, civilized Europe. Because the previous generation who fought for independence of Ukraine, all the dissidents, the protests in the early 90s, trying to make sure that Ukraine stays independent. I grew up from those stories from my teachers and then later lecturers in the university. And I think we've realized that it's now our responsibility to take the country further, to make sure that we get rid of Soviet legacy of corruption, to make sure that we put in place processes that ensure that Ukraine doesn't become a failed state, something that Russia has actively pushed for in European institutions, that, we need to be discarded. We don't need to be taken seriously because there is a tremendous corruption. Ukraine is not a state. It should always be under Russia's umbrella. So breaking that narrative internationally while actually trying to build the state within to make sure that everyone works to the most of their capacity. That was a tough time. And of course, all the protests were not just during the revolutions, but in between, because as you've rightly mentioned, we were going through transformation. The leader of the political party that I was a member of, she was in prison for 3 years for political persecutions, as later European Court for Human Rights has established. So it was a constant battle.
And how is your brother getting on?
I just spoke to him actually half an hour ago. He's well. He's on rotation in the north of Ukraine right now after he came back from the training here in the UK, where he was being trained by British soldiers in the north of the country. And so I had the chance to go see him there for an hour and a half. And it was really heartwarming to see him here, to make him also see how warm British nation is towards the Ukrainians. He was also quite fascinated by that and couldn't say how stunned he was by.
So presumably he wasn't in the military before the full-scale invasion, is that right?
No, he wasn't. He was working in logistics. He also has a degree in political science, just like myself. We studied together in school and then in university. Actually, even though he's 1 year older, I decided to follow his footsteps, and we kind of went for the same topics in the university, and we're very close throughout our whole lives. He's now in military, and he actually volunteered because he said to me, our family, his wife, that he was mobilized in March of 2022. But then one of his friends actually confessed to us. There was a time when we didn't hear from my brother for about 3 weeks, and it was really getting nerve-wracking. And that's when one of his friends reached out to me and said, look, whatever happens, I just want you to know that he's actually volunteered. He didn't want you to be worried or to be angry. And of course, his wife, who just had their first baby in January 2022. So he tried to hide that from all of us. But what he said to his friend is actually he saw civilians trying to leave Kyiv in the first days of war. He watched that on TV, just people getting shot dead in the cars, civilians, children, elderly, just trying to flee the war. And he said that he can't just sit and watch because the next day they can come to his hometown, and his family could be at the same risk. So he decided to go volunteer, and of course, as nerve-wracking as it is for all of us, we are extremely proud. But as all Ukrainians are, and it's getting really nerve-wracking by the day. That doesn't really go away. It's not a feeling you can get used to. You kind of learn to manage it, of course, but every time I feel like I can't take it anymore, I just remember of him and think, well, if he's okay in this freezing temperature somewhere in the forest or in the trench, then there's no reason to complain for any of us, really.
And is he about to be deployed then to the front line?
I think in January is his estimated date when he's going back to somewhere in the northeast. I believe currently one of the hottest areas is Avdiivka. And last year he was part of a liberation of Kharkiv region, cities of Izium, Liman. So knowing that area, I think he will be sent somewhere in the same location just to capitalize on his experience.
Does he tell you much about what he has seen and experienced?
He does. It normally is perhaps 2 or 3 weeks after he's experienced that, because from their point of security, he can't really disclose locations. For example, when I talk to him live, only when he's on rotation, when he's on the front line and he has his 3 minutes a day on the phone, he doesn't really tell me where he is or what he's doing. Just, I'm fine, and that's okay. And then he can have a longer call sometimes and then tell me everything, what he's seen. Like, for example, in Izium or Liman, the mass graves in the forests that we've all seen on TV, he was actually there discovering them firsthand. And all the other horrendous stories about, losing his friends or seeing them getting blown up in mines. Because the biggest danger actually of the last year was not so much Russian artillery as the landmines. And it was quite difficult to lose people, mostly because of that.
And in spite of what he's experienced, and in spite of the fact that this does look like it is going to be a long war, he is still highly motivated, I presume.
He is, Kate, but I must say that I'm noticing the difference, and I hope if he hears this, he will forgive me. But I feel like this is also something that people, and I won't say people, that's too general, the governments and the decision makers in the West will understand. Ukrainian people are still very motivated. The soldiers on the front line, I have never seen and didn't really expect such bravery and resilience and determination in defending their homeland and their families. But I could see the difference even from summer when I went to see him in Ukraine when he was on the break. And I can hear what he's talking about now. Going into winter, I guess seeing that nothing really has moved tremendously after this year, because we're talking about Ukraine fatigue in the West and perhaps the failed counteroffensive. But Ukrainian soldiers are the first ones to see that when they ask for, when they have artillery and they don't get it, when they have extremely limited supplies of ammunition, and the ratio of Russian versus Ukrainian ammunition on the front line sometimes goes to 1 to 30. So he says they can fire 300 shells a day, and we only can spare 6, for example. And when you hear those numbers, it's ridiculous. Or the Western weapons that don't really work because they've come from the warehouses and some stockpiles that haven't been checked for many years, and just going through that, or having very limited number of javelins that are, of course, very effective against tanks, for example, but all of a sudden them failing on the field. So I can see and I can hear the tone of exhaustion. The motivation didn't go anywhere. There's no disappointment, but there is this underlying chronic exhaustion that I'm sure he's not the only one feeling. That I can feel that he absorbs it from his teammates, of very limited resources and supplies, and enormous capacity of Russia. And he even said to me, well, there's 3 million potentially of Ukrainian soldiers ready to be deployed and to fight on the front line across the years, but there are 30 million of Russians. And how long is this war going to go on? He's definitely prepared for the next 10 years. That's what at least he said to me.
10 years, really?
He said, giving, this current level of supplies to Ukraine, and of course, our motivation and determination to fight the Russians. But if it goes on as it does, Russia will potentially have some, quieter times, ceasefires. But eventually, if we don't make one big concerted push and push them out of the country, they're saying that, yes, it seems like it could go on for another 10 years. If you remember, the war has started in 2014, and it's already been 10 years to date.
With the annexation of Crimea. Of course, you are currently in the US. I'm just wondering how you're using your time there and what you're up to.
I've arrived here for the Reagan National Defense Forum that's happening just outside of Los Angeles. It's an annual gathering of congressmen and women, officials from the national security defense sector of the United States. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will be a keynote speaker here, and there are other many breakout sessions on Monroe Doctrine, on how the US sees their engagement in the world in 2024, what's going to happen geopolitically with all the wars emerging and constant global disruptors, and what will be the United States' role in this. And of course, given that it's organized by the Reagan Foundation, they are talking about Reagan Doctrine 2.0, which is extremely reassuring to see that topic on the agenda, given that there have been some mixed signals from the United States whether they will remain strongly involved in the international effort or not, or maybe there are some isolationist moves from some presidential candidates. So I think it's very reassuring to hear them talking about this now. And I will definitely make sure to speak to other officials that I've met before and take the topic not just of Ukraine and the need to help Ukraine, but also the need to stand in a united front today, because we can see the clearly formed, as people have phrased it, axis of evil, with Russia working with North Korea and Iran, a war in Ukraine, war between Israel and Hamas, potential wars in Balkans breaking out again. We're not sure what China is going to think about the elections in Taiwan in January 2022. And there is no way that this is the time when the biggest sponsor of global security, the United States, can simply withdraw itself just because of some internal political differences.
Obviously, the people that you will be mixing with there will be highly educated and knowledgeable about what is going on in Ukraine. What sense do you get, though, beyond that, about the interest and support for Ukraine in the US? Just anecdotally.
I must say that I was just in Washington, D.C. at the end of October, so a month ago, effectively. And I could already feel that compared to my August visit when I was last there, that the interest has faded tremendously. Everyone was talking about Israel war, obviously was front of the headlines and it was top of the agenda. But there was this tiredness from Ukraine war, I think going into political year, and we can effectively say that the elections in the United States have already started, I feel like Ukraine has become this topic of pre-electoral quarrels amongst politicians. And that's always heartbreaking to see. And that's what I try to tell these highly educated people, as you say, who are very well informed, but still feel like they need to look towards domestic politics to secure their political positions. And that's a constant balance for them.
And what do you say to people who are either sympathetic to who are those Republicans holding up President Biden's aid package for Ukraine and conflating it with domestic demands over the migration issues and the US-Mexico border? What do you say to them?
It's very interesting what they say to me, Kate, because
Go on.
I find it that I don't need to convince anyone. They know very well, and I'm sure they're not just trying to comply with what I'm saying because I'm a Ukrainian and they just want to get out of that uncomfortable, potentially, conversation for them. They understand the need to support Ukraine, but what they're saying to me, especially the Republican congressmen and members of crucial committees in the House, or in the Senate, they say to me, we understand how important it is to support Ukraine, but every time I vote for the aid package, Tucker Carlson comes up with some narrative, and all of my voters are watching him. And that's the next day I'm facing primaries. So again, it's that very sensitive political situation, which has become not very healthy for a Republican Party because they used to be, again, followers of Reagan and United States being a strong actor on the international stage, and they've now completely lost it. And it's very interesting to see how Democratic Party is taking the baton almost and is being the stronger global actor advocate than the Republicans, which is really strange.
And how do you react to that kind of explanation that's given to you?
I think as a former politician, I completely understand it. I know how difficult it is to balance the right decisions that strategically will save the situation versus the expectations on the ground and how difficult it is to translate that sometimes. I think the most troubling thing there is that it comes from the leadership. It stems from the conflicting narratives. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that those political leaders, candidates like Donald Trump, like other candidates like Vivek or DeSantis or anyone else, that they stop actually just using contrarian pre-electoral narratives and be a bit more responsible about foreign policy, because that effectively has a tremendous effect on geopolitics. And maybe even Nikki Haley and follow her narrative more closely. So I think it should come from the leadership that those voters look up to, and for them to be a bit more responsible.
You will have the opportunity while you're there, I don't know if you already have, to meet CEOs of American defense companies as well. How far has Ukraine's defense industry come since the full-scale invasion, and what is the most pressing issue they're facing?
I have spoken to several representatives of US defense companies as well as the ones in the United Kingdom. This weekend is going to be very interesting, actually seeing CEOs and hearing what they have to say about the defense sector, because they're looking at various mechanisms of procurement of new tools of warfare and the future of war, which I think is going to be very interesting. And one of the most valuable lessons that I hear from these defense companies that they've learned from the war in Ukraine is the interoperability, the pitfalls in that, and the potentials. And interoperability, just to explain to the viewers, is when weapons from various countries who are allies, NATO allies, for example, and beyond that, that they actually work together and they can be used by one single army. That has proven to be the biggest challenge in Ukraine on the battlefield. When you have different tanks, different artillery systems, different ammunition, and you run out of one, and it's impossible to replace the stock from another country. So that seriously needs to be an issue on NATO's agenda. And I think US defense companies will obviously be at the forefront of that. Another thing is actually testing the new weapons on the ground in active warfare and everything, especially the tech that is being used on the battlefield, the drones, the loitering munitions, and various types of that, application of artificial intelligence on the battlefield in Ukraine. Ukraine has become this testing ground for these defense companies, and they have obviously been really happy because they get to test their weapons live and then improve their product, and sell it both to Ukraine and other countries who are now actually rearming themselves in the wake of two wars in Europe and an extremely sensitive and volatile situation in the world. But at the same time, they have received tremendous funding from the US government, because actually, when we talk about financial support for Ukraine from the United States, who is today the biggest donor, but 60% of that goes towards US producers and manufacturers of weapons. They, of course, don't talk about it as loudly as I guess Ukrainians would like them to. And that's number one thing that I tell them when I speak to them is, look, our financing is in jeopardy. We don't know where it's going to go next year. And there's this predominant narrative, again, spread by the opposition, that we need to stop funding Ukraine because we have our own problems. And the defense companies who are receiving 60% of that funding don't really want to come out and be that voice saying, look, this funding actually goes to us and provides you Americans with jobs, salaries, social security, etc., because they also don't want to seem as they're being warmongers or they're capitalizing on the war. So again, politics always gets in the way of defense, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's never simple, is it? What about in Ukraine itself, its ability to be building up its own capability in its defense sector?
I think defense sector in Ukraine is very exciting right now, if I could use that word for the defense sector. It's one of the strategic industries that has seen a rapid development. Ukraine has always been one of the biggest producers of Soviet Union of weapons. But the thing is, with Soviets trying to secure the interdependence between the republics, they wouldn't really place the whole cycle of production in one country, in one republic. So, for example, Ukraine would develop missiles, and the other particles of that missile launch system or artillery system would be based in another country. So we would never really have the autonomy. Like, we would have tanks produced in Kharkiv, the factory that unfortunately got destroyed by one of the Russian missiles, because that's the number one thing that they started targeting in Ukraine as soon as the war started, all of our production facilities. And then the ammunition for that would be developed elsewhere. But what we have, and what we haven't lost yet with the war, an extremely valuable asset, is human resource, the engineers, people who are experienced in that, who have the knowledge and who can apply it now, especially invested into the new technology that's emerging, and working with the Western partners on that. So we have seen one defense conference that has already happened in Ukraine, in Kyiv, where many Western companies came, and I know that many agreements have been signed between the public and private sector, in Ukraine, the UK, and the US. 6th and 7th of December, actually, is where the similar conference is being held in Washington, D.C., and that's where it will take the main focus. As you probably might have seen from the news, companies like BAE is already in Ukraine. They've opened their office. The German Rheinmetall. I know that Babcock is also looking at going into Ukraine and having some kind of partnership with Ukrainian military. So it seems like Ukraine being in that position, and we've talked many times from 2014 that, Ukraine needs to be an Israel in its own kind, meaning that we always now need to be prepared for the war, that we need bomb shelters for every family, that we need to be ready to defend ourselves, that we need some kind of our version of Iron Dome. And it's become even more apparent with the second invasion that Russia obviously is never going to go away. We're hoping that one day they're going to transform into some form of liberal democracy, but being ready to defend ourselves would be the key. And I think that public-private partnerships are the answer to that, and the only realistic way to secure that.
It's interesting because with the war now going into its third winter, everyone, as you've already kind of talked about seem to be accepting of the fact that this is going to be a long war. I was speaking to a veteran who's also now an analyst earlier on, who said that Ukraine must be supported to win the war without the total destruction of the country in the process. And what you're talking about there, about that kind of those shoots of investment and those business deals that are going on, they kind of juxtapose completely with the complete devastation in other areas. I mean, how resilient do you think those areas are in Ukraine at the moment that are continuing, where society is going on more or less as normal?
It's very hard to say how successful are other areas of economy. One thing that we need to understand is we're very grateful again to the United States and to the European Commission, who are the biggest funders of our social spending. So pensions, any social care that's being covered by foreign governments right now. And I think the most troubling thing that I've heard so far, not just the lack of weapons and ammunition sent to Ukraine, but when Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said that he might consider stopping all the funding for social care in Ukraine, that will certainly just leave people without means for survival. And that's the most tragic thing that can happen for the country who's been so exhausted at war for 2 years now. Economy, of course, is running in the territories where there are no active fighting going on, like my hometown, Chernivtsi in the west, for example. We have seen many IDPs move in there, and they were so resilient and active that they started their own businesses. I, for example, owned a coffee shop still, and I was running it remotely while I was here in London, back home, and I just had one of the refugees, the displaced people from the east of the country, reach out to me and say, "I've noticed there's this coffee shop. It's sometimes open, sometimes not. Can I buy it off of you?" And it was a woman who just moved there with kids and tried to start her life all over again, and she already has, I think, 3 of those coffee shops. So you could see the resilience in small business. And I think, if I remember correctly, the numbers that were quite fascinating that I've learned at the Reconstruction Conference that was held in June in London, only 2.7 businesses closed down in Ukraine, small and medium businesses. Everyone else tried to either change the supply chain, change the business, change the location, apply new technologies, look for new ways to innovate, expand their base, move online. So it really also prompted the development of business sector. Many of those business owners, especially if they were women, they have moved out to the West. They found new partners. So they weren't really, while the war was going on back home and they were worried about their loved men who were left behind, they were trying to develop their businesses and secure, again, new technologies, ideas, sponsors, and investors into businesses in Ukraine. And I've seen many examples of those. So I'm hoping that business will be fine. Of course, it depends on how long the war will last, because it's very difficult to operate under martial law, and it's very difficult to operate when you basically don't get any subsidies from the state, because everything is geared up towards defense.
I just want to draw your attention to an article that appeared in the Times newspaper. It's saying that Ukraine's national security advisor, Oleksiy Danilov, claiming that President Putin has activated Russian sleeper agents in Ukraine to destabilize the country, make it ungovernable, stoke divisions between the president and his commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And how resilient is Ukraine's leadership and its people, do you think, and its politics to this kind of interference?
I think that's the most troubling factor that could play into difficult situation in the war. As we've seen, Russia is very weak militarily. The only thing they have is the mass and the scale of their army. They have not proven to be effective on the battlefield, but they're very good at hybrid warfare tools. And that's everything from espionage to sleeping agents to spreading disinformation, sowing this division and discontent. And actually, we've already seen several of those. He's talking about only one element, about perpetuating the differences between the military leadership. And in all honesty, I've spoken also to some of my friends and sources, shall I say, in Ministry of Defense, in Ukrainian Parliament, President's administration, to actually, because curious myself, to ask, does that alleged or rumored division between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, does it exist? And they said to me, there are some differences inevitably. And with 2 years at war, you inevitably have many different conversations, arguments about strategy, what's the best way to approach the war. But it's not nearly as bad as it is being presented in the media. And the same goes for social issues. So one of this operation that Danilov is talking about, President Zelensky also mentioned it as Maidan 3. I think he said it also to one of the Western media he was giving his interview to, saying that this is now a concerted effort starting from November and December for Russia to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, to use the exhaustion of Ukrainian people from the war, spread this loss of hope. So when this operation is twofold, it's working both for the Western audience and it works domestically. For the West, their main goal is to say Ukraine is corrupt, put that back on top of the agenda. You don't need to send them your money or weapons because it's going to get stolen anyways. All those rumors, if you heard about Ukraine selling off Western weapons somewhere on the black market, I think that narrative reappeared somewhere a month ago or so. And at the same time in Ukraine, they're saying the West has abandoned you. No one really cares about Ukraine anymore because everyone's focused on Israel. They're giving up on you yet again, as they have done before. So playing on those weaknesses that Ukrainians have experienced before with the Minsk agreements, when we were almost forced to concede territories and to sign some sort of ceasefire that Russia ended up violating all the time, just to appease, I guess, first of all, Russia, and then make Germany and France happy with their collective decision that they've achieved. So those narratives are playing on both sides, and it's a very difficult time right now with them.
And what are you doing? Are you trying to counter those narratives?
Absolutely. I'm speaking to Ukrainians first and foremost and saying to them that, look, you don't need to be as categorical. The West has not given up. Yes, attention has moved away, but that's how media works. If there's an active new war breaking out, inevitably we'll get more coverage. The policy is still very much focused on Ukraine. The United Kingdom is not going anywhere. They've dedicated the same amount of money in 2024 as in 2023. I think Europe is now determined more as ever, with potential withdrawal of the United States from the global stage. They're getting ready to actually defend and fund their defense themselves. So Europe is not going anywhere. And I'm trying to counter those narratives for Ukrainians to make sure that there is no disappointment, because that's the main goal, to destroy the motivation of Ukrainian people, that it's not all black and white. There are many nuances, as I do for the West, saying that, yes, we were an inherently corrupt country, but no one is selling any weapons in the West because there's so little of them in Ukraine. Corruption is being dealt with, especially with our assimilation with the European Union and our 7-point action plan to rid of corruption. So it's about working both ways. And this is when I've never felt that my platform meant more, because it is effectively another front line for all of us, the information warfare.
Obviously, the anniversaries of both revolutions have just passed. Can you tell me about your part in the Maidan Revolution?
In 2004, it was purely participating as a volunteer, very romantic, very determined, still having those idealistic views that this is it. We're going to stand here on the square. We're going to oust the unfair result elections. We're going to have new ones. We're going to have democratic president. And that worked. But of course, later, some disappointment inevitably followed. And I think that disappointment helped work for the next 10 years, all the way to 2014, to the Revolution of Dignity. And that's when I was already one of the coordinators of the protests, making sure that people from my hometown, Chernivtsi, in the west of Ukraine, get to Maidan in Kyiv safely, because we always had to surpass various police stations, etc. It was quite difficult logistically. It was very difficult emotionally to keep the spirit of the protesters in the freezing temperatures on the square in Kyiv going. making sure that you say the right things on the square, making sure that all the people are still safe and sound, because that's your responsibility. And later, of course, witnessing the most tragic events of my 20s when I saw peaceful protesters getting shot in the streets. I think that really shaped even tougher resilience, I think, to Ukrainian politics. But also, I didn't realize it at the time, but it certainly prepared me for the war that was about to start in my home country just 2 weeks later after that.
Were you expecting it?
I don't think so. I personally wasn't. Perhaps other more experienced politicians at the time who knew Russia throughout the 90s, who could see the dynamic. And I spoke to many of members of parliament who were MPs in the 90s, that it didn't really come as a surprise to them. I was personally shocked when I remember that I've just returned from Maidan home to see my parents, to tell them, okay, I've survived, everything is okay. And then seeing on the news that there are Russian soldiers who've just entered Crimea, and it seems like we're going to lose the peninsula. I really remember that moment vividly.
And what went through your mind at that moment then?
I remember one phrase that came to my mind, and it gave me chills, really. I thought to myself, I now live in a country at war. And it was really blood chilling, because I grew up with my great grandmother, because my parents had both me and my brother very young, so they were still in the university. And I remember she was babysitting us, and she was always telling us stories about the war that she survived, the Second World War, and then later one of the famines imposed on people by the Soviet authorities. And she would always tell us that with such life thirst and resilience, and only saying everything will be okay. All the hardships that Ukraine is going through now, poverty, inflation, the reshaping of Ukrainian politics. She was saying to us, everything will be okay as long as we don't have war in our country. And I went back to those memories, and I thought to myself, well, we are now at war. And I bet she would not believe that Russia started that war in Ukraine.
And what is it like for you now in the UK, watching what is going on in Ukraine? Because your brother, for example, is fighting on the front line.
First of all, I'm still in awe, to be honest. And I was really surprised in the beginning. And I keep being surprised at the amount of support that I've received personally as a Ukrainian when the war first started. The outpouring was just unbelievable, of the kind words, of the aid. Everyone was offering to send humanitarian aid, asking me what I need, offering even to, take me up for a cup of tea if I need to talk to someone. People have been most kind and generous with their time to me. So I can't express enough how much I was really surprised by the level of personal support that I have received, and also the support that a Ukrainian state has received from the United Kingdom. It was really fascinating to see shaping that global alliance to support Ukraine as well. I think Britain has definitely led the way there.
And you have this privileged position of having been in the inside circle of Ukrainian politics with a deep understanding of the country, to now be able to see it from a different perspective from the UK. How do you see your purpose with regard to your role at the Henry Jackson Society?
I first of all felt highly responsible as a Ukrainian, that I am now, as you said, in a privileged position, being especially now managing director of a think tank, that I have the voice and the platform that I should definitely use to always bring attention back to what is happening back home. Because we've been through various stages. The interest and the support for Ukraine would go up and down based on what was happening in the country. It is especially, we're now in that phase when, everyone is saying that the counteroffensive has failed. The year that we're almost come to an end of has not been as successful as anticipated. We're going into the new year, what to expect. So I always feel like I want to bring back more information on Ukraine, so that people understand that the war actually is not over. and that people are still struggling and dying every single day. But at the same time, I feel enormous amount of responsibility as now a resident of the United Kingdom, as a member of British society, which I'm most privileged to be, to make sure that I deliver a very objective and non-biased information on Ukraine. I'm very open and honest, always talking about corruption in Ukraine, because that is an issue that I personally, as a young politician in Ukraine, I've suffered from it myself. I had to say no many times to many votes that I didn't feel like were right. I eventually think that that was one of the reasons why I decided to end my career, or at least put it on pause for some time, and move to the UK and work somewhere in the field that was still relevant to politics and perhaps more foreign policy and international relations, but still take a step back from politics, because it does, when you spend your whole youth in that environment and you always need to fight, it kind of wears you out and burns you down a little bit. So I always felt like I also want to make sure that I deliver the most objective and true information about what's happening in Ukraine, all the challenges we're facing as a society, as a young democracy, and where we potentially could need help to improve that situation.
And do you think that the political situation has improved in Ukraine since you were a politician? I mean, you mentioned that you were part of your disillusionment, I presume, if I can don't want to put words into your mouth, but that was perhaps why you wanted to leave politics. Has the corruption that you alluded to, have things improved?
Looking at it from the outside, I would say yes. It's very difficult for me to say not being there, but also the young politicians who were members of parliament with me for the first time when we all started in politics, when we were 25 and 27, they're still MPs now in Ukraine. And I talk to them regularly and I ask them about the state of affairs. How are things changing? I think certainly the situation has improved. There is that sense of joint responsibility for the enormous amount of lives that Ukrainians are losing, and that sense of responsibility that the politicians now have that perhaps they didn't used to have, the sense of unity, the feeling that all the soldiers who are now sacrificing their lives, who witness all the horrendous things on the front line, that they will eventually come back for some accountability if the politicians try to act differently, if all the most precious humanitarian, financial, military aid doesn't get allocated correctly. So I think that feeling is deeply embedded now in Ukrainian politics. I think some instances, inevitably, as we heard emerging last year or before with all the massive sackings that President Zelensky was doing, I'm sure that that's part of the process too, but I think we're well on our way.
And just finally, if I could get you to reflect, please, interesting that you're in the US at the moment of the passing of the former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, playing a significant role in relaxing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Even President Putin has paid tribute to him, praising him as a wise and pragmatic statesman. And it's almost a year since he publicly did this U-turn to support the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. How will he be remembered in your country?
Henry Kissinger is an epoch, and I think his passing is certainly an end of that epoch. He represents the evolution of Western thinking, I think, in terms not just Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Soviet bloc, but in terms of geopolitics. It's very telling that at first there was a very bipolar world. There were United States and then there was the Soviet Union, and everyone within Soviet Union wasn't really considered as an entity. And I think we expected that to be true. And as Ukraine and other republics and other states have proved their agency and independence and actually sacrificed so much, I think we could see that shift in thinking in the West generally, and it translated into even Henry Kissinger being the representative and I guess the voice of that epoch, changing his mind and changing the narratives and understanding the change in the region. I think that's what's effective. We have definitely moved away from the bipolar world. We're looking at multilateralism, not so much. I don't think it's formed yet. I think it is being formed right now as we speak, the new international world order, as you like. And I think if he were to live for another 50 years, he would even change that thinking and perception of what the world looks like right now. And he would look at various little agents of influence in their own sphere, and that would be a brand new world. So I think for Ukraine, he will definitely go down in history as someone who's deeply respected, not always agreed with, just because of that national identity that we always knew we had. But it took us some time and unfortunately enormous sacrifice to showcase to the world and to convince even Secretary Kissinger himself.
Aliona Hlivco, it's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you so much, Time, and I wish you the best for the rest of your trip.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.